for a Hindu, how important is this caste?
For Hindus, religion is just a superficial coating. The real structure is caste. Liberal when it comes to religion, they're not very particular about any one form of worship, any one god, any one place of worship. They have no particular doctrine, particular dogma. You may believe this or you may not believe that, participate in this festival or not. You can even be a non-believer and yet be part of the Hindu religion. But what was very rigidly enforced, what was non-negotiable, what was inviolable was caste. Caste rules they had to observe. So you can't intermarry, you can't interdine. Caste was just the opposite. That is what was operated at the micro level. All that happens through caste associations. Religious leader can't expel somebody from Hinduism. It is the caste body that expels.
I want to slightly pivot to one thought that came in my mind while I was going through a book. I understand the scope of the book is to show what are all the litigation process, what are all the laws that got enacted through that, and what are the legislation process and the entire history, right? But what about the people's movement during that time, right? I know that is not the scope of the book as I mentioned, but um, how influential was the people's movement too, like protests, like mass movements?
Yeah, the most uh, well-known example is what Ambedkar did in Mahad Satyagraha in 1927. First, it was a conference where people gathered in large numbers, Dalits gathered in large numbers to do what? To just scoop a handful of water and drink. Something as innocuous as that,
Right.
something as reasonable as that. There was one big public tank uh, which was supposed to be accessible to them. Why? Because in the year 1923, there was a resolution that was passed by the Bombay Legislative Council. It was at the instance of S.K. Bole, which said that all these uh, common resources should be accessible to all people, all sections, including Dalits, right? But that was not being uh, enforced. On the ground, that those restrictions were as uh, oppressive as ever.
Mhm.
So, as a test case, uh, Ambedkar and his followers
Right.
gathered there, and that was something that made a huge impact. And later that same year, because when they did that, uh, they broke the caste uh, restriction. It
Right.
was not against the rule of law. There was no bar. In fact, it was in keeping with that Bole resolution, right? So when they did that, there was a pushback against them from dominant castes in Mahad. There was violence. These people were beaten up, and within a few months, the British courts rendered justice. Those assailants were jailed, and uh, later that year, Ambedkar said, since there was this kind of pushback from them, we will uh, take it to another level. They performed what is known as Satyagraha, and in the course of that, in December 1927, they burnt pages of Manu
Manusmriti.
Smriti.
And
So,
one other incident I remember, since you're talking, the temple entry protest for Kadaram
yeah,
temple,
Kalaram Temple,
Kalaram temple.
yeah,
Yeah,
in Nasik.
Nasik.
So that was something which again met with violence.
Mm.
There was so much violence
Yes.
that Ambedkar engaged with that for a while, and then he was so disenchanted. Look, why do we want to enter temples? Because you say that we are Hindus. The minimum that would be expected of members of a religious community would be that they would all have the freedom to gather at one place of worship on the assumption that all are equal in the eyes of God. And that is what happens among Muslims. where whether you are a king or a fakir, you all stand in the same mosque, in the same rows,
Mm.
and worship. And that's what happens in Christianity. There's no such discrimination between Christians at least in the West.
Mm.
In India, because of the caste influence, you could see that even when they convert, they would still not be. Why? Because religion is just a superficial coating.
Right.
Caste is the real.
So in Indian society, irrespective of whether you call yourself a Hindu or a Christian
Yeah,
or Muslim.
it's your caste. Caste is your core. This is just your skin,
Mm.
very superficial. So this this shows that. So what happened was this man realized that I mean this was the trajectory of his uh, learning,
Mm.
of his understanding of the caste problem. There was a time in 1930. He, I mean, it was a very well thought out plan of his. He chose that temple and he attempted temple entry on the assumption that caste Hindus would realize that this is freedom that they need to give to uh, people who are supposed to be part of the Hindu community, right? But they were still so brazen and they attacked Dalits. So he engaged with that for some more years, and then in 1935 he ended it, and he came made to that famous declaration in Yola. I was born an untouchable, but I was born a Hindu, but I will not
Never
die
die.
a Hindu.
And going through this book once again, Manoj. So there are a lot of instances where the progressiveness was pulled back by actions by very conservative Hindus. I've seen that. But there are also instances where there were some progressive Hindus, not necessarily the oppressed caste, but some progressive Hindus from an upper caste too. They were trying to make reforms too. So one thought that was lingering in my mind was all, yeah, the intention was good, and their actions were noble and everything in certain way, but all they were doing is to reform the system, right? And I believe the answer to these issues related to caste is not in reforming the system, or at least was not in reforming the system, but to annihilate, as Ambedkar called out, right? So in the course of that book, were there any incidents other than just making a reformation like Sati? So that was towards a step towards annihilating something, right?
Yeah,
Like completely no compromises.
yeah.
Were there any instances before Dr. Ambedkar a step towards annihilating the system
I
itself
mean, even in his lifetime,
in his lifetime? Yeah,
or afterwards.
yeah.
Yeah. I in one chapter I discuss the struggles that went into bringing about a reform that is as basic, as reasonable as um, allowing intercaste marriage. This issue was taken up for the first time in the year 1918 by Vittalbhai Patel, who was none other than the elder brother of Vallabhbhai Patel. And he came up with a bill which said, intercaste marriage should be legal and the children of intercaste marriages should be legitimate. Why did he suggest that? Because at that time there were lots of such marriages that took place and they were all beyond the pale of law.
Mm.
Those children were not recognized as legitimate children, and the husband and wife were perceived to be living in sin and so on. So this kind of um, prejudice should end, is what his concern was. Yet there was a major pushback in the legislative council, and that pushback was from the Hindu right of the time. And that Hindu right was not the Hindu right that we are accustomed to seeing today, because uh, RSS, after all, came into existence only in 1925. And I'm talking about something that happened in 1918.
Mm.
And Hindu Mahasabha was still at a very nascent stage. The Hindu right that pushed against this legislation was from within Congress, which was a big tent. So you had people like Madan Mohan Malviya, Surendranath Banerjee, who were at different points of time president of the Congress Party, who made noises to the effect that this is something that is going to undermine our religion, it endangers our religion. That's how they linked intercaste reform, intercaste marriage reform to uh, something that will, the modern rhetoric in India is Hindu khatre mein hai. So they said something to that effect in their debates, right? So seeing that kind of opposition, something that that man was forced to drop. I mean, he couldn't do anything about it. But there were several attempts after that. I mean, these were all attempts made by people who were caste Hindus.
Mm.
Some of them were Brahmins. And the last such attempt was made in 1948, and that legislation was finally passed in 1949. And that legislator who piloted it was a Brahmin, Thakur Das Bhargava from Punjab. And at that time, he did not meet with any resistance. He, in fact, says that I am inspired by what Vittalbhai Patel did in 1918. He uses more or less the same provisions, calls it the same bill, and yet the response he got was just the opposite of what Vittalbhai Patel got. In 1918, there was all this talk about Hinduism being in danger on account of intercaste marriage. But in 1949, when this was passed, it was passed unanimously. Nobody objected to it. So what happened to that concern? The only thing that changed was that the colonial rule had ended. So they did not have scope anymore to scapegoat the colonial rulers. Uh, it would be evident that they are themselves coming in the way of such a reform, which was in the interest of Hindu community. So all this goes to show again that the Orthodox Hindu sections, which call themselves Sanatanis, mind you, those who were in these various debates that took place during the colonial period concerning different aspects of caste reform, the forces that objected to those reforms, the conservative forces, the reactionary forces, the forces for status quo, maintaining status quo, called themselves Sanatanis. And their opponents were called Arya Samajis or
The
reformers.
reformists.
Yeah. So that was a kind of battle that was going on at the time. And finally, in 1949, which means over 30 years later, the intercaste marriage legislation could be passed. And the delay is because of the resistance put up again and again by the Sanatani forces. Sanatanis were basically people who would say that, it's all unchanging. Whatever was the norm 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, would still apply. Nothing would change. And those norms would essentially be about caste, because their daily lives were governed by caste, right? So they would say you have to. Intercaste marriage was disallowed in the past, and it should continue to be so. And they were most particular about these Sanatani elements who argued. And this is the title. This is how they were referred to, and this is how they called themselves. Sanatani discourse was all about maintaining that caste, restrictions unchanged from times immemorial. So they said, on the basis of scriptures, most importantly Manusmriti, they said there were two kinds of intercaste marriage: Anuloma and Pratiloma. Anuloma means where the husband is from an upper caste and the wife is from a lower caste. So they said all forms of intercaste marriage are wrong, including Anuloma, but that can still be in some exceptional cases tolerated. But what is absolutely forbidden, what will not be accepted in any circumstances, is pratiloma. Why? Because that was an instance of an upper caste woman marrying a lower caste man, and that was also an instance which shows that caste is very closely enmeshed with patriarchy.
Mm.
And in their perception, that woman is their property, and she's the custodian of their purity. That notion of purity that they suffer from.
Mm.
So they said there are no circumstances in which a woman of our caste would marry a lower caste man. We might, in some situations, marry a lower caste woman if you are attracted to that woman or whatever. That that would be bad, but that can still be tolerated. But what cannot be tolerated under any circumstances is pratiloma form of marriage. So these are the kind of objections that these orthodox elements, these Sanatanis were raising. That is why it took over 30 years for something as reasonable as intercaste marriage to take place. And because of that prejudice being so deep-seated, that even after all these decades since then, 49 means, I mean, so many, over 70 years have passed, 78 years have passed, intercaste marriage is still not the norm. We might have a lot of anecdotal evidence of intercaste marriages in our circles, but if you take the big picture, it is still way below 10%. That's still not the norm. And even in this day and age, even in progressive states like Tamil Nadu, where intercaste marriages take place, there are instances, shocking instances of those marriages leading to honor killings. You know? So,
Yeah, that's the sad state, right? And talking about the girl, the Pratiloma and Anuloma,
yeah.
so the caste system closely connected to the patriarchy.
Right.
And you mentioned that in the patriarchy system, women is considered as an object of a private, like a property, right?
An immovable, as a movable
Movable
property.
property. And we have seen this sentiment to girl being the pride of the family.
Hmm.
And connecting to your book title, Caste Pride,
Yeah.
it makes sense, right?
Yeah.
In a way, in a sad, logical way,
Yeah.
why it exists through
Yeah.
these means. Yeah, that's
Ironic.
ironic, right? Yeah, that's the right word. Talking about these reforms, right? Before closing, I'd like to get your thoughts on the progressive Hindu society, right? I'm not talking about the conservative portion of that,
Yeah.
the progressive Hindu society. The reason I'm asking is, before I will tell the reason, it is in America, I'm with the Indian diaspora.
So before you ask me about American diaspora, I
Mm,
mean the Indian diaspora in
sure.
America, let me complete that point about
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Since you yourself raised that there have been uh, that the battles that I'm referring to,
Mm,
battles for equality in Hindu India, they're essentially battles between two sections of Hindus, progressive Hindus and conservative Hindus or Orthodox Hindus, right? And you had people of all castes in both sides. I mean, the progressive Hindus were not only lower caste people, there were lots of Brahmins too. In fact, in the earlier decades, when lower caste hardly had access to education, it was some enlightened liberal sections among Brahmins among upper caste who fought for reforms. So, what does this indicate? This indicates that the caste system, that this Brahminism, is so untenable that even people from the sections that benefited from it uh, found it to be reprehensible, found that to be unacceptable, and fought against it.
mm,
So this is therefore something that even whether it is in the context of temple entry or access to all sorts of public resources, public spaces, there were battles on all fronts. You know, when those battles took place, it's not that the it was a battle between upper caste and lower caste. No, it's a battle between progressive Hindus and conservative Hindus. So I keep strategically, whenever there are any upper caste people, especially Brahmin reformers, I highlight that fact because it serves to uh, you know drive home the cruelty of the system, that a Brahmin could easily have not bothered about that reform. Like, for instance, in uh, the Constitution, freedom of religion provision, you have a clause relating to uh, Hindu institutions like temples needing reform. So there's a clause in the Constitution which says that freedom of religion does not mean that these Hindu institutions cannot be reformed. Why did they do so? Because a Brahmin uh, member of the Constituent Assembly, that is K.M. Munshi, who's otherwise seen as a hero by the Hindu right. It's important for us to recall, for us to remember that this man, Munshi, who's himself a Brahmin, said that he was the one who uh, drafted that clause and introduced it and persuaded the Constituent Assembly to ensure that it is part of the Constitution. Because otherwise, he said that what is stopping these upper caste people, especially Brahmins, they are capable of saying that for us, freedom of religion means that our temples should be free of any pollution, which these lower caste people, especially Dalits, will cause. So, if you are giving us freedom of religion, then you should give us the freedom to keep Dalits away from temples. By then, those battles were already fought for a long time, for decades, and he was aware of it. So he knew, as an insider, he knew how perversely these upper caste people will interpret that freedom of religion and use it against lower caste people. Because again and again, as I said, religion is just a superficial coating.
Mhm.
Deep down, it is. I mean, at the core, they are all caste. It's all about caste. So they knew that they don't care about whether those lower caste people have access to temples or not. It's only about their so-called caste hegemony, that caste purity is all they were concerned about. So you have this example, which is very embarrassing to casteist elements because it's a reform that was proposed by by an upper caste person. Yeah.
So if I can,
It was not Ambedkar who introduced that clause. They would like to believe, oh, Ambedkar did it. It is actually Munshi who did it. And that says something about how evil that Brahminism is.
mm,
That Munshi himself had the need to suggest
introduce
that.
that. So if I may coin this way, the battles for the equality in Hindu society is was between or is between the progressive Hindus and the backward Hindus,
Progressive Hindus and conservative Hindus,
conservative Hindus, and
Orthodox Hindus.
Orthodox Hindus. So coming back to my question, so this progressive Hindus um, in America, I'm now shifting to American diaspora. I've seen these progressive Hindus. They call themselves Indians, Hindus, especially the one who call themselves Hindus. I've seen many of them giving voice to many progressive movements like the LGBTQ movement, women's rights movement, equal pay for women in America, and the Black Lives Movement, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to the caste problems in India or the caste struggle in India, the issues around caste in India, they turn a very blind eye towards it.
Yeah.
They are very either they are indifferent or they just don't care kind of attitude they give. How important for a progressive Indian in America or anywhere in Western who tries to align with the ideals of progressiveness, Western progressiveness, how important it is for them to pay attention to the caste struggles in India?
See, this what you are touching upon is essentially about this conundrum we face of people pretending to be liberal, but at the same time they would be completely in denial over all the evidence that is there of historical, injustice done to um, a very substantial section of the population in India, right? So, as a result of which, there are all these people who may be described as caste deniers or untouchability deniers. They are no different from, say, Holocaust deniers or climate change deniers. The reality is there, but they willfully disregard that. So you have uh, such attitudes among any number of people who pretend to be liberal and who would say that in all seriousness, they say that the number one problem in India is reservations. You do away with reservations, then it would be such a wonderful nation, right? So that with those kind of uh, you know, notions, people could be spreading all over the world. And as Ambedkar very presciently said, that you can't you can take a Hindu out of India, but you can't take a caste out of a Hindu. So wherever Hindus go, they'll carry caste with them, and caste will become a global problem. And that prediction of Ambedkar, we can see it unfolding.
Right.
I don't know if that answers your question, but what attitudes Hindus betray in America are no different from the attitudes that they have in India. People who are very deeply invested in Hindutva are also people who abhor reservations. The overlap between the two is striking, almost 100%, you know.
Right.
So you can hardly come across somebody who's into Hindutva and who would at the same time be truly, you know, appreciative of the need for reservations and other such measures of affirmative action. It's only political compulsion that makes them, uh, you know, give some space, form of tokenism, but they don't do it with conviction. It doesn't come from within.
Right.
It's a compromise that they are forced to make on account of democracy requiring numbers.
True.
So to sum it up, I mean,
Before that, just to your add to your point, yes, those kind of people, especially I've seen people who are against reservation in India are also against affirmative action here.
yeah.
Yet they think they are more progressive because they support women's rights and LGBTQ rights.
Mm.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, just a minute.
So I'm focused on the relationship between Hindutva and caste. So the overt aspect of Hindutva is that it is something that targets Muslims, but the covert aspect is about putting lower castes in their place, even as they apparently seek to consolidate the Hindu community. Uh, this contradiction is at the heart of Hindutva. They cannot openly talk against lower caste, but their DNA is um, not just consolidation of Hindus. Consolidation of Hindus is a political compulsion, forced upon them by the way democracy functions. Right? They need to have enough numbers to be in power or come to power. But there, the, the inarticulate premise of Hindutva, what they cannot openly admit is that they would want to reinstate that old Varna Vyavastha, the old Ramraj, in which Shudra will not dare transgress his caste limits and, like Shambhuka, perform things that are reserved for upper caste. So that's the kind of notion they would have. That's something that they would never admit. So they would only talk about, the way that bias of theirs comes out is in the way they attack reservations, despite all the good that reservations did. Which is not to say that reservation system does not need to be reformed. Just now, for instance, there's a great deal of churn going on within the Dalit community on the recent Supreme Court judgment on subcategorization. There are two views on it, and it is perfectly reasonable for one section to hold the view that it's not uh, so unreasonable to say that they should be allowed to have a separate sub quota so that they also can access reservation benefits because they are truly uh, more in need of that help, relatively speaking.
Yep.
Right? So there is there is scope for reforming the reservation system, but should that go away? Far from that. I mean, that's the fact that so many caste atrocities still take place, that people are still in denial over that, only shows how there is still need for affirmative action in India.
Thank you, Manoj. It was great pleasure talking to you. Thank you once again for being with us.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Thank you.